He ruled the sky without ever showing his face, then vanished like vapor on the wind. But some say he never left, just changed altitude. They say he didn't cry much as a baby, that his mother worried at first, thinking maybe something was wrong, but it wasn't silence, it was listening. Born in the sunburned heart of Sinaloa, Amado Carrillo Fuentes grew up beneath a sky that never stopped moving. He was the kind of boy who stared upward for too long, eyes tracing clouds like they were maps. While other boys played soccer in the dust, Amado watched airplanes scratch white scars across the blue, his mouth barely moving, counting the seconds between the roar and the fade. His father was a rancher, stubborn and quiet. His mother, devout and tired. They had too many mouths and not enough coins. In the evenings, the air smelled like burnt sugar and diesel, and Amado would sit outside, watching the wind pick fights with the trees. He was the middle child, which meant he had to be louder to be heard or quieter to be ignored. He chose the second. By the time he was 10, he was already helping with the cattle, already understanding that this land, the cracked earth and rusted wire fences, would never be enough. He learned to listen before he spoke. He watched how men lied with smiles, and how silence could be sharper than a blade. He watched his uncle too, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, Don Neto, a name that made grown men lower their voices. He drove up in a white Lincoln once, windows black as secrets. Amado was 12. That night, he didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, not with fear but with direction. The planes started soon after. Not his, not yet, but whispers. Stories of men who could cross borders with nothing but confidence and a good pilot. Stories of money so high you had to stack it in warehouses. And every story ended the same way, with someone looking over their shoulder. But Amado didn't flinch. He started asking questions. Quiet ones. Not the kind that raised suspicion, but the kind that made grown men pause mid-sentence. He asked about runways, about cargo weights, about fuel. And somewhere between adolescence and ambition, the boy who looked up decided he wasn't going to die in the dust. At 14, he watched a plane land in a hidden clearing. It moved like a whisper, no lights, no noise, until the wheels hit earth. The man who stepped out shook Don Neto's hand. Amado stood in the shadows and memorized everything. The handshake, the duffel bags, the clock on the dashboard glowing red. By 15, he knew. He wouldn't be a soldier, wouldn't be a priest, wouldn't be a king. He would be something else, something faster, something that didn't need roads. And when he finally closed his eyes that night, the boy who once watched the sky now dreamed of owning it. There are families that grow flowers, and then there are families that grow silence. Amado Carrillo Fuentes was raised in the second kind. In the backroads of Sinaloa, the last name Carrillo didn't need explanation, it came with weight. The kind of weight that kept windows closed at night and made priests hesitate before asking questions. His mother tried to keep the rosary close. His father tried to keep the cattle fed. But the real power sat in the passenger seat of a black Lincoln every time Don Neto came to visit. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, his uncle, his example, his warning. They called him Don Neto, and when he walked into a room, the room changed temperature. Men twice his size stood straighter. Voices dropped, and Amado, still barely a teenager, would stand just outside the door, not speaking, not moving, just listening. That's where he learned that power doesn't raise its voice. It nods, it pays, and if needed, it disappears you. Don Neto didn't carry gold chains or wear loud shirts. His wealth was whispered, not flaunted. His reputation wasn't earned. It was inherited, expanded, and protected. He ran with the founders of the Guadalajara cartel, the architects of modern trafficking. They didn't just smuggle drugs. They built systems, routes, loyalties, and lies that lasted decades. Amado absorbed it all. He never asked to be included, but they let him close because he knew how to vanish inside a room. At 15, he already understood that fear can be worn like a suit. At 16, he was translating silence into strategy. He didn't carry a gun. He carried information. That made him more dangerous. Don Neto gave him small jobs first. Airport runs, inventory checks, counting, always counting, money, crates, names. Amado's memory was a vault, and no one noticed him until they needed something only he remembered. He had no interest in the streets. That kind of heat burned too fast. He wanted altitude, distance, movement. He started flying with couriers just to learn their patterns. He'd ask questions mid-flight about fuel, altitude, tailwinds. Pilots joked that he knew their routes better than they did, but no one laughed too long. Because when Don Neto looked at Amado now, he didn't see a nephew. He saw succession. In time, Amado began stepping out of the shadows, just enough to be seen but never enough to be caught. He wasn't chasing a crown. He was building a runway, one that didn't need kings, just takeoff. And as the years crept forward, those early bricks laid by Don Neto became the foundation of something bigger, something airborne. The shadow that once stood behind the throne was now learning how to fly over it. In some homes, respect is earned with patience and love. In others, it's carved out with fear. The Carrillo household breathed that second kind, not because everyone shouted, but because no one did. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on the skin, not peaceful, tense, like the air before a thunderstorm. Chairs were pulled quietly. Doors were closed softly. Even laughter, when it came, felt like a risk. Amado learned early that speaking too much could invite consequences, not always from his father, who was more absence than presence, but from the invisible weight that ruled the house. A glance, a pause, a name said too loudly. The men in his family didn't explain themselves, they didn't need to. When something was wrong, you knew before you heard it. You felt it in the shift of footsteps on gravel, in the way the dog wouldn't bark. His mother carried rosaries like they were shields. Every night she whispered prayers not just for salvation, but for delay. That tomorrow, the knock wouldn't come. That the car wouldn't be parked out front. That no one's son would be missing by dawn. She never talked about what Don Neto did, but she always lit a candle when he visited. Amado grew up surrounded by uncles, cousins, and neighbors who didn't work jobs, at least not ones you could write on paper. They wore boots that never got dirty. They carried phones they never used in public. When they spoke, it was in half phrases, unfinished sentences, codes wrapped in compliments. And Amado listened. That's how he learned the language. Not Spanish, not even slang, the real language. The one made of raised eyebrows, of names dropped like bricks, of old debts remembered in silence. Respect wasn't something you demanded in this world, it was something you absorbed, like smoke. It came from fear, yes, but also from consistency. If you said nothing and did everything, they remembered you. By the time he was 17, Amado had already outgrown the house that raised him. He didn't yell. He didn't fight. He didn't rebel. He just drifted upward, like fog rising from the hills. Quiet, slow, unstoppable. And every time he passed a mirror, he didn't see a boy raised in violence. He saw the future that silence had shaped. It was never about pride. It was about legacy. Not the kind etched in stone, but the kind whispered through families like a haunting. The kind you don't ask for, but carry anyway. And deep down, even back then, Amado knew some men are born to build empires. Others are born to inherit the ghosts that built them. It didn't start with guns. It started with wings. Small ones, at first. The kind you'd find on rusted crop dusters dragging shadows across the hills of Sinaloa. Amado used to pause mid-task just to watch them drift overhead, their engines coughing like old men trying to remember youth. While others saw machines, he saw freedom. Not the loud, messy kind. The quiet kind. The kind that slipped past borders without asking for permission. The first time he touched a cockpit, he was still a teenager. One of Don Neto's pilots had grounded near the family's ranch due to weather, and Amado offered to bring him food. The man waved him into the plane, told him to sit, asked if he wanted to see what power looked like without blood. Amado said nothing, just stared at the dials, the controls, the sky waiting beyond the windshield. That night, he didn't eat dinner. He just laid awake, arms crossed behind his head, imagining the hum of an engine under his feet and the entire world slipping beneath him like a slow river. He began showing up at airstrips uninvited, saying he was just there to help. He fueled engines, scrubbed metal, swept hangars, all for nothing but the chance to be near flight. Pilots laughed at first, then stopped, because Amado wasn't wasting time. He was learning. Every switch, every route, every minute of refueling. He memorized codes, fuel weights, time zones. And when no one was looking, he'd sit in the pilot's seat and close his eyes, like a priest entering a chapel. It wasn't just about flying. It was about disappearing. Planes didn't shoot. They outpaced. They didn't beg. They negotiated with altitude. Amado understood that the sky didn't care who you were. It only cared if you had the nerve to rise into it. Don Neto noticed, of course. He always did. One day, without warning, he handed Amado a folder. Inside, schedules, coordinates, and a one-way ticket to a private airstrip near Mexicali. No words, just a nod. That was the beginning. The first shipment was small, a test, but the flight went perfectly. No hiccups, no noise. When the wheels touched down, the man who met him didn't say, "Well done." He just handed him another route. Amado never celebrated. He just kept flying, kept learning, kept building a map inside his head. A map made of wind patterns and customs loopholes, of silent runways and paid-off towers. And every time he took off, he felt less like a man and more like a shadow, faster, quieter, harder to catch. He hadn't fired a bullet. He hadn't spilled a drop of blood. But somewhere between takeoff and landing, Amado Carrillo Fuentes stopped being a boy and started becoming the Sky King. Guadalajara didn't just smell like gasoline and sweat, it smelled like ambition. The kind that moved fast, paid well, and buried slow learners. Amado arrived with quiet steps and sharper eyes. Don Neto brought him in close, not out of affection, but precision. The boy had already proven he could fly. Now he needed to learn how to land without being buried under someone else's empire. The Guadalajara cartel was not a school. It was a crucible, the kind of place where loyalty was demanded in public and discarded in private. Amado stood beside men who had killed with their bare hands and prayed with the same fingers. He said little, listened always, and learned that the most dangerous men were the ones who smiled too much. Don Neto didn't speak often, but when he did, Amado absorbed it like scripture. Never trust a man who offers help before being asked. Never owe someone who drinks faster than he thinks. And above all, never be the loudest in the room. Those were the kinds who didn't last past winter. Amado watched how alliances shifted like desert wind. One day you shared a drink, the next you were digging the other man's grave. He understood quickly that survival wasn't about loyalty. It was about timing, knowing when to nod, when to walk away, when to offer a smile that meant absolutely nothing. He ran errands first, logistics, schedules, drop points, the kind of tasks that didn't earn praise, just kept you alive another week. But he did them flawlessly. Every crate arrived. Every pilot returned. Every number matched. Eventually, the older men stopped checking his work. That was their mistake. Because while they were busy celebrating their old victories, Amado was charting their weaknesses. He saw where the money bled, where the roots stuttered, where the silence should have been louder, and he kept it all inside. Like a man tucking away a knife until the right night, Don Neto noticed the shift. His nephew had stopped acting like an apprentice and started moving like a threat. But he didn't panic. He smiled. Because in this world, power wasn't inherited, it was sharpened. And Amado was becoming a blade. By the end of his time in Guadalajara, Amado no longer walked behind men. He walked beside them, quietly, calmly, already planning the day he'd walk past them. Loyalty had gotten him in the door, but disloyalty, when timed just right, would open the next one. He shook hands with men he would later replace, took orders from men who would one day vanish. And every night, as he lay staring at the ceiling of a borrowed apartment, he repeated one lesson to himself like a prayer: survive everyone, especially the ones who call you family. Smuggling wasn't taught in classrooms. It was learned in silence, in shadows, in the back seats of idling cars, and the muffled clink of weighed packages. Most men picked it up the way boys learned bicycles through scraped knees and shouted warnings. But Amado? He was already watching before anyone handed him the handlebars. Already counting turns, angles, winds, risks. While others memorized routes, he memorized margins. He didn't just want to move the product. He wanted to understand the bloodstream of the operation. They gave him a clipboard. He brought a notebook. Not for appearances, he filled it with codes, timings, pilot quirks, tower shifts, fuel rates. Things no one else paid attention to because they were too busy playing the part. He kept watches synced. He checked weather reports before most men checked their mirrors. He wasn't trying to be perfect. He was trying to disappear inside precision. The other runners mocked his questions at first. Asked why he cared about altitudes or radio lag. But they stopped laughing the night his backup plan saved $3 million in cargo from a grounded plane and a suspicious patrol shift. After that, they gave him space. Respect didn't come with titles in this world. It came from knowing when to shut up and still be right. He didn't fly the planes often, but he sat behind the pilots, always watching. He noticed how they leaned during turbulence, how they shaved seconds off a landing approach, how their voices changed when they were nervous. He took notes no one else thought to take. He started adjusting routes by minutes, not hours. By the slant of a hill, the weight of a crosswind, the corruption level of a sleepy border town. He wired information like a spider weaving a net. Phones, radios, walkie frequencies all synced, all fed into a rhythm only he heard. He never yelled. He didn't need to. He spoke once, clearly, and things moved, or they didn't because he told them not to. And when something went wrong, he already knew the 5 reasons why. Watches became sacred to him, not because of the time, but because of the control. Every second mattered. A delay of 10 could mean a lost shipment. An early arrival could mean a locked gate. He trained men to think in seconds, to sweat the details, to respect the quiet math behind every successful run. And slowly, without anyone saying it aloud, Amado became the system, not a pilot, not a trafficker, a clockmaker with wings. He didn't wear gold yet. He didn't flex muscle. He didn't need to, because in the time it took others to light a cigarette, Amado Carrillo Fuentes could redesign a smuggling route, and no one ever saw it coming. He didn't wear chains. He wore silence, while other men flooded nightclubs with noise and let bullets speak for their ambition. Amado sat in dim rooms with coffee gone cold, studying papers that no one else cared to read. He didn't care about muscle. Muscle got tired. Muscle bled. But math never flinched. He watched how others built their empires with gold teeth and armored trucks. They paraded down streets that would one day be stained with their names. Amado didn't want to be seen. He wanted to be inevitable. So he stopped thinking like a smuggler and started thinking like an economist. Every route became a formula, every border a variable, every mistake a data point. He studied radar towers like they were chess pieces, learned when they rotated, who operated them, how often they were updated, and which ones were still running on outdated tech. He paid informants not to speak but to listen when were patrols swapped, which agents were new, which checkpoints had dead zones. He learned which cities could be bought with favors, and which ones needed favors wrapped in threats. He didn't brag. He calculated. He tracked fuel consumption down to the liter. He adjusted delivery schedules by weather patterns. If a shipment arrived 10 minutes too early, he saw a flaw. If a pilot got flagged twice in a month, he was pulled, no questions. Amado didn't need to raise his voice. His spreadsheets spoke fluently in survival. Others mocked him behind closed doors, said he lacked heat, lacked presence, that he moved like a ghost chasing decimal points. But those same men started copying his routes, his timing, his pilots, until even their success wore his fingerprints. The cartel world was full of lions fighting over the same piece of meat. Amado just built a new kitchen. He tracked cocaine like a surgeon tracks blood flow. He knew which corridors were saturated and which could be rerouted. When planes were too risky, he used tunnels. When tunnels collapsed, he used trains. When trains got watched, he used fishermen with hollowed-out engines. He didn't fall in love with any method, only the math behind the method. And every time someone asked how he stayed one step ahead, he smiled without showing teeth. Because they didn't see the pages taped to his walls, the maps lined with pins, the surveillance logs filled out in ink that never ran. They didn't see the part of the game that didn't glitter, the quiet, exacting pulse of control. Amado Carrillo Fuentes didn't win with war. He won with margin, with timing, with patience. While others ruled for a moment, he was building a legacy measured not in years, but in algorithms. And no one ever saw a bullet coming from a calculator. He didn't need to yell. That was the first thing you noticed. Amado Carrillo Fuentes could walk into a room full of killers and never lift his voice above a whisper, and yet somehow, everyone leaned in. He didn't announce his power. He wore it like a scent, sharp, quiet, and unforgettable. Other men exploded, Amado observed. Other men threatened, Amado calculated. He didn't demand loyalty. He made you afraid to lose his trust. The men who worked for him learned fast. When he asked a question, you answered carefully. Not because he might hit you, but because he never would. And that was worse. Because silence from Amado meant your name had already been moved to another column, the one that led nowhere good. His charisma wasn't the kind that made you cheer. It made you reconsider, rethink your habits, double-check your promises. He could walk beside you for 10 minutes and leave you wondering if you had said too much, not enough, or the wrong thing entirely. And if he smiled, you prayed it was real. Because if it wasn't, you might not sleep well that night. He rarely touched a weapon. He didn't need to. His words moved faster than bullets. His instructions came once, no need to repeat. He didn't pace. He didn't fidget. He would sit with perfect stillness, listening as men pleaded, bargained, lied. He'd tilt his head slightly, as if studying a puzzle that was already solved. And when he finally spoke, it was with the cold precision of a man who had already buried every alternative. The strange thing was, people wanted to please him. They wanted to be noticed by him. There was a gravity to his presence, like being pulled into orbit around a star that never flared but always burned. Even men who outranked him on paper began deferring to him in practice, because while others postured, Amado planned. He was not flashy, not cruel for sport, but if you crossed him, the punishment was clinical. No warning, no spectacle, just a quiet shift in the air and then you were gone. That kind of control didn't come from muscle, it came from certainty. The absolute, bone-deep confidence that if he whispered, "Do it," it would be done. His pilots called him El Señor. His lieutenants called him Jefe. But behind closed doors, they all agreed on one thing: Amado was different. He didn't run the game with fear. He ran it with inevitability. And in a world of shouting men, he built an empire on silence. The plane didn't even have a name, no markings, no stickers, just a thin silver body that caught the sun like it had something to prove. It wasn't flashy, but it was fast. And more importantly, it was on time. That first shipment wasn't massive, a few bricks, a quiet route, but Amado watched it like it was a crown being flown across the border. He stood on the edge of the airstrip with his arms behind his back. Not pacing, not blinking, just tracking the descent like a man counting heartbeats. The wheels kissed the ground with no wobble. The doors opened smooth, no sirens, no dust, no delay. It was clean, too clean. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Most men remembered their first shipment for the money, for the thrill. Amado remembered the margin of error none, the takeoff, the wind shift, the approach angle. He had studied it all like a surgeon planning his first cut. And now, watching it land, he didn't feel excited. He felt confirmed. The pilot stepped out and nodded once. That was the deal, no congratulations, no chatter, just a nod. Amado gave him an envelope, already sealed, already weighed. He didn't check the product. He didn't need to. He had planned for every mistake, and none had happened. That told him more than any inventory list ever could. Back in the car, he didn't celebrate. He jotted notes, adjusted 2 variables on a worn-out route sheet, marked down the fuel use versus forecast. He filed it under a name only he would recognize. This wasn't a one-off. This was a test flight, and it passed. Later that night, the others drank, told stories, clinked glasses. Amado stayed quiet in a corner, sipping slowly, watching the room. He knew the ones who laughed too loud wouldn't last. The ones who boasted would fall. The ones who asked questions, those were the ones he remembered. Quiet meant curiosity, and curiosity could be refined. That first plane, nameless and silent, was never used again. Not for flights, anyway. Amado had it moved, stored it in a locked hangar outside of Torreon. To him, it wasn't just metal. It was a beginning, a monument, proof that precision could move weight without making noise. He never told anyone why he kept it. But years later, when things were louder and the stakes were measured in coffins instead of kilos, he would sometimes visit it, sit inside it, close the door, and for a moment, feel the quiet again. That pure, flawless moment when everything moved exactly as he had imagined it. No fame, no fear. Just sky, metal, and the man who had just begun to rise. At first, the routes were stitched together with guesswork and borrowed favors. Old airstrips, borrowed hangars, friends of friends who owed debts from forgotten years. It was all quiet, small runs. Just enough to learn, just enough to fail without echo. From Sinaloa to scattered fields across Chihuahua and Sonora, Amado flew under the radar, not just literally, but in reputation. No one feared his name yet, mostly because no one knew it. He was fine with that. Each flight was a test, not just of distance or delivery, but of people. Could this mechanic be trusted not to talk? Could that tower agent be bought without regret? Could weather reports from a tired rancher actually predict wind shifts better than the government ones? He logged it all. Every risk, every mishap. Even the flights that went wrong didn't bother him. He welcomed them. Failure was information. One time, the package landed late. Another time, the fuel calculations were off by just enough to make his hands sweat during descent. He never yelled. He never blamed. He sat in the cockpit, eyes forward, and made mental notes as calmly as if he were reading a menu. After landing, he didn't sleep. He rewrote the plan. The others, those already established, didn't notice. Why would they? He didn't swagger. He didn't show off. The weight he moved wasn't impressive yet. But what they missed was the pattern. Every week, his margins improved. Every month, his timing tightened. Every new route lasted longer than the one before. He learned how to pack the planes so they wouldn't rattle, how to land on dirt without choking the engine, how to swap tail numbers mid-route. And he learned which pilots could be trusted to follow orders exactly and which ones thought they knew better. The latter group got replaced, quietly. Amado was building something, but not loudly. While others chased recognition, he was chasing invisibility. The fewer people who asked who he was, the more space he had to grow. If a shipment was late, he fixed it. If one got intercepted, he disappeared it from his record. No excuses, no stories, just course correction. He started calling it air math, a formula of flight paths, fuel, weather, human error, and bribed silence. Sinaloa was just the start, the test tube, the small stage where he could fail without notice. Because once he got it right, once the system ran like breath through lungs, he knew exactly what came next. Sky, scale, sovereignty. He didn't dream of being famous. He dreamed of altitude, of routes that stretched so far and moved so cleanly that even the stars would struggle to track them. And down below, the ones who missed his rise would one day look up and wonder how the sky had changed without them noticing. The empire had cracked, but not yet crumbled. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was falling not with a bang, but with silence. Courtrooms, transfers, chains. And with every whispered verdict, a new question spread across the cartel world like smoke in a locked room. Who would rise next? Most men reached for guns. Amado reached for a map. Juarez had always been valuable, but now it was exposed. The corridors were wide. The customs officers were hungry. The runways were dusty but long enough for what Amado needed. It wasn't a throne yet. It was an opening, and he stepped through it before anyone else could even frame the opportunity. He didn't declare it. That wasn't his style. He just started flying more weight through its veins, quietly, consistently. Where other traffickers saw a crumbling border plaza, Amado saw a logistics hub. Where they saw gangs and confusion, he saw patterns begging to be streamlined. He didn't fight for Juarez. He absorbed it. The lieutenants who had once answered to Félix Gallardo began taking his calls. Not because he threatened them, but because he made them money. Fast, clean, repeatable. In a world of chaos, Amado was control. In a city famous for its noise, he became its heartbeat. He moved into the shadows of Juarez, like a pilot descending through fog. No dramatic landings, just a steady glide path that ended with him sitting at the center of its most vital routes. By the time the others realized he had taken it, he had already buried his roots too deep to be pulled out. Amado didn't just want territory, he wanted infrastructure, warehouses, contacts in customs, trusted mechanics at the airfields, radar coverage he could predict. He didn't paint the streets red, he paved them. And those who worked for him didn't just protect turf, they managed schedules. There was no coronation, no parade, just results. Shipments that arrived early, arrests that stopped happening, payouts that came on time, every time. And with each smooth delivery, his authority cemented not in fear, but in dependability. Other bosses made people tremble. Amado made them breathe easier. He didn't need to tell Juarez it was his. The city already knew. And up in the sky, the planes flew heavier, farther, faster. Because now, there was a man who understood how to turn air into empire. The vacuum left behind by Félix Gallardo hadn't just been filled, it had been transformed. Juarez had a new owner, and he wasn't shouting about it. He was flying above it. It started with one nameless plane. Now there were hundreds. Old crop dusters, repurposed jets, sleek Gulfstreams with gutted bellies. Some painted, some bare. Some so ordinary you'd never look twice. Together, they made up an air force unlike anything the underworld had seen. Amado Carrillo Fuentes didn't just move weight, he moved nations. He didn't brag. He didn't pose in front of his fleet. But in hangars scattered across Mexico, in clandestine airstrips carved out of jungle and desert, his wings multiplied. The numbers whispered behind closed doors didn't sound real. Hundreds of flights a week, hundreds of tons each month. But the product kept arriving, untouched, unbothered, on time. Pilots called him El Señor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies, not because he flew, but because he owned the sky. He had figured out what no one else dared to attempt: scale through invisibility. One plane was easy to spot, 10 raised suspicion. But when you made the sky itself, your ally, when you mapped the clouds and charted patrol shifts, like a maestro conducts a symphony, you could fly an army through it without raising dust. He didn't deal in chaos. He dealt in velocity. If a route slowed down, it got replaced. If a pilot hesitated, he was gone. Everything ran like clockwork, and Amado was the man holding the gears. He didn't just move cocaine, he orchestrated an economy, landing rights, refueling stations, bribed control towers, custom-built runways with exact slope gradients. This wasn't a cartel. It was an aviation empire with a product no one dared challenge. The DEA, the Mexican authorities, the press, they all started noticing, but it was already too late. By the time they traced one plane, 10 more had flown. By the time they busted a warehouse, 3 new ones had been stocked. He was not ahead of the game. He was the game. He didn't celebrate success. He refined it. The aircraft kept evolving larger holds, better fuel efficiency, radar-deflecting paint. Pilots were rotated frequently to avoid patterns. Codes changed weekly. No plane carried the same tail number for more than a few flights. Every delivery was part of a breathing, adaptive organism, and Amado was its quiet, calculating heart. He became legend not with gunfire, but with flight paths. While others built bunkers, he built altitudes, and while the world below drowned in blood and headlines, he soared above it all, silent and untouchable. The king had come, but his crown wasn't gold. It was wings. Amado Carrillo Fuentes didn't need to spill blood to prove power. He just needed altitude. While other traffickers flexed with body counts and public executions, Amado preferred the sound of turbines over gunfire. He understood something they didn't: violence makes headlines, but silence builds kingdoms. He didn't want to rule by fear. He wanted to rule by disappearance. If someone betrayed him, they didn't get gunned down in a nightclub or found in a trunk. They just never got another call. Their name vanished from the manifests, their access revoked, and in a world where everyone craved proximity to power, being shut out was a death sentence of its own. His pilots joked that his wings were sharper than any blade, and it was true. While enemies schemed over turf wars and ambushes, Amado was 30,000 feet above them, rerouting entire shipments with the press of a radio. If a plaza got hot, he flew around it. If a governor got brave, he waited him out. He had learned early that bullets were loud, but altitude was undefeated. Every time an enemy expected retaliation, Amado offered nothing. No warning, no counterstrike, just stillness. The kind that made you check your mirrors twice. The kind that made even killers second-guess whether they were already being watched. Because that was his genius, he made absence feel like presence. He knew the game was bigger than bodies. It was logistics, timing, relationships. His enemies wanted chaos. He wanted corridors. They wanted fear. He wanted flow. While others built reputations with blood, he built networks in the air routes too complex to trace, alliances too subtle to break. He made himself too useful to kill and too quiet to corner. Law enforcement struggled to pin him down because he refused to stay in one place. While others lived behind guarded gates, Amado lived in motion, always flying, always shifting. Hotels under fake names, houses under no names. Even his meetings were airborne, discussed mid-flight between cities where no one could listen in. He didn't fear death. He just outran it. In the end, his avoidance of violence wasn't weakness. It was mastery. He understood that true power doesn't need to scream. It needs to move. And that's what he did. He moved faster, smarter, higher. While the world below played checkers with corpses, Amado was already flying past the board. Because when you can outfly the storm, you don't need to start one. Amado didn't build a cartel. He built a company, a real one, with org charts, with payroll, with accountants who carried sidearms and wore Rolexes. Every piece of it ran like a machine, because to him, chaos was weakness, and weakness got you caught. His men didn't wear street clothes. They wore crisp slacks, tucked shirts, polished shoes. They looked more like bankers than traffickers. That was the point. You didn't see them coming. They blended into airports, into customs offices, into government buildings, not because they hid, but because they belonged there. He had managers, not capos, logistics officers, not couriers, HR meetings that reviewed more than just behavior, they reviewed loyalty. If you broke protocol, you didn't get screamed at. You got erased from the system, badge revoked, file closed. Amado didn't threaten people. He removed them like a typo in a spreadsheet. The death clauses were understood. You didn't sign anything, but everyone knew. Betrayal didn't mean bullets in the street. It meant a quiet evening, a knock on the door, and silence that followed. Amado believed violence was loud and messy, but deletion? That was elegance. He issued burner phones like a corporate policy. Flight logs were updated daily. Bonuses were given for efficiency. If you delivered early, you got paid early. If you talked to the wrong person, you never got paid again. There were no second warnings, only clean exits. At the center of it all sat Amado, silent, suited, almost priest-like. He didn't need to yell to command attention. His stillness was the threat. His orders were like legal memos, dry, precise, irrefutable. He didn't say, "Do it." He said, "This is how it will be done." And it was. He treated operations like supply chains. Product in, product out, fuel tracked, time logged. Every plane was a moving asset. Every shipment had insurance. Every landing was a test of system strength. If a single link failed, he didn't punish it, he replaced it. One of his closest accountants once said, "We don't work for a criminal, we work for a perfectionist." And that was the truth. Amado wasn't obsessed with control for power's sake. He was obsessed with structure. He believed disorder was a kind of death, and he refused to die because someone else couldn't follow instructions. Even the pilots were given dress codes, not for vanity but for discipline. He believed that how a man wore his collar said everything about how he'd handle a crisis midair. Amado turned the drug trade into a corporate empire, one where death wasn't personal, it was procedural, and if your watch ticked louder than your heartbeat, you already knew who signed your checks. The map wasn't drawn on paper. It lived in Amado's mind like a living organism, fluid, pulsing, adapting. From border towns to Caribbean islands, from desert runways to private airfields in South America, it shifted like a tide. No route stayed the same, no pattern repeated, because in Amado's world, predictability was a death sentence. Each plane was a blood vessel, each route a capillary. Airports throbbed like organs in a body that never slept. At the center of it all was a mind that didn't rest. He studied radar logs the way surgeons study scans. He saw which routes were swollen with risk, which ones flowed clean, which ones needed cauterizing, and he adjusted. Some runs went north over the Gulf, gliding low like shadows on water. Others weaved through Baja, using mountain ranges as cover. Some stopped in Guatemala to refuel and mislead. Some flew without lights, guided only by instinct and coordinates whispered over encrypted radios. A single change in weather could reroute 20 planes. A single rumor of a checkpoint could ground half the fleet, and he would still deliver on time. Amado didn't move product. He moved motion itself. There were days when even his closest men didn't know which routes were live. That was by design. If only he knew the full pattern, only he could break it. His enemies could never hit what was never still. He named his routes like Poem's Ghost Line, Eagle Drift, Bone Sky. They weren't just paths. They were systems of trust and timing. A pilot might use a strip once and never again. A warehouse might light up for 1 hour then go dark forever. That was the rhythm, a map that breathes. He trained his men to think like air traffic controllers, not soldiers. They didn't watch borders, they watched pressure. If one point in the network started to tighten, the whole system adjusted like a heartbeat under stress. Cargo would shift directions mid-flight. Tail numbers would be swapped mid-runway. Planes would land, fuel, and lift off in under 10 minutes. No signatures, no records, no certainty. Sometimes, not even Amado knew where the package would end up when it left the runway. But he trusted the system, because he didn't build it with muscle, he built it with breath, and as long as it breathed, it lived. They called him the Lord of the Skies. But he never ruled with altitude alone. He ruled with a pulse, a quiet, unbroken rhythm only he could hear. And when the map breathed, the world obeyed. They flew without names, without pasts, without futures. Ghost pilots, they called them. Men who once wore uniforms, who once saluted flags, who once believed in borders now flying above them, through them, past them, with no allegiance but fuel and fortune. Amado didn't want loyalty. He wanted precision, and these men delivered it. Most came from air forces, trained in combat maneuvers and dead-stick landings, trained to make decisions at 700 miles per hour. They weren't thugs, they weren't cowboys. They were professionals, cool hands on throttles, eyes that could read the sky like scripture. They didn't flinch, they didn't ask questions, they just flew. He paid them well, more than well, sometimes in cash, sometimes in gold. Once, in the deed to a ranch they'd never even seen, but the money came with risk written into its folds. Because the higher they rose, the more invisible they became. Until one day, they didn't come back. No funerals, no bodies, just silence. Sometimes a plane would vanish over the Sierra Madre, and no one would speak of it. Sometimes one would touch down, engines still warm, and the pilot's seat would be empty. It wasn't betrayal. It was math. Amado knew the cost of speed. He factored it in. For every 10 pilots trained, maybe 6 would survive the year. That's how it worked. They weren't martyrs. They weren't heroes. They were instruments, trusted, respected, forgotten. Some wore dog tags from their old lives. A few carried family photos folded into their jacket linings. One always flew with a tiny Bible tucked above the dashboard. None of it mattered in the end. The moment they left the tarmac, they became ghosts. Amado never mourned them. He honored them in his way. A grounded plane was stripped for parts. A downed pilot's call sign was retired. No reuse, no recycling. Ghosts deserve rest, even if names were never spoken out loud. Every now and then, a new recruit would ask about one of the lost. The older ones would just shake their heads. Don't chase echoes, they'd say. Fly clean, land quiet, leave nothing. Because in Amado's world, the sky was sacred. But it was also a graveyard. And the ghosts? They never stopped flying. Juarez didn't belong to the government. It didn't belong to the people. It belonged to Amado. Not on paper, not in the headlines, but in the quiet ways that matter, the way traffic stopped for certain convoys, the way officials blinked before answering a question, the way priests paused before blessing a child in public. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. His fortress wasn't made of walls. It was made of roots, of silence, of payrolls that stretched into City Hall. From the edge of the desert to the heart of the market, everything breathed with his rhythm. His men didn't march in uniform. They strolled in plain clothes, radios tucked in their belts, eyes trained to scan every doorway and rooftop. The city didn't resist. It adjusted. His airstrip sat just outside town, camouflaged between dust roads and scrub brush. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing. But if you stood there long enough, you'd feel it: the buzz of turbines, the quick flicker of landing lights, the scent of fuel carried on desert wind. Planes came and went like ghosts, their wheels never leaving tracks, their cargo never seen. Below the surface ran the real secret tunnels, miles of them, dug not by desperate migrants, but by engineers with blueprints and bribe money. Tunnels that bypassed security, dipped under checkpoints, emerged in safe houses already swept for bugs. Some were wide enough to drive through. Some had ventilation. Some even had lighting systems rigged to solar panels. The city above walked on a web of secrets, and only Amado held the map. But it wasn't just infrastructure. It was people. Everyone knew someone who owed something to the man in the sky. A cousin who got a job unloading crates. A nephew flown to medical care no one else could afford. A debt paid quietly by someone who never asked for repayment. That was his genius. He didn't rule through bullets. He ruled through balance sheets and favors. Even the churches didn't feel untouched. Priests said their sermons more carefully. Crosses felt heavier. Confessions were shorter. Because sin, in Juarez, had hierarchy. And at the top of it sat a man who didn't need to raise his voice to control a city. He just needed to exist. You couldn't walk through Juarez without passing something that had passed through him first: money, product, rumor, threat. And, if you listened carefully, you'd hear it in the static between radio stations, in the way people said, "Señor," without a name. Because the city wasn't guarded by guns. It was guarded by silence. And silence, in Juarez, had wings. They never wore his name on paper, but they worked for him all the same. Not the men in the streets, the men in towers. In glass offices overlooking cities, in courtrooms with marble floors, in hangars where clearance badges opened every door. Amado's reach didn't end at the runway. It climbed ladders, all the way up. Judges who never saw the evidence. Mayors who never saw the planes. Airline executives who never noticed their cargo holds carried more than luggage. They didn't need to be threatened. They needed to be included. A favor here, a sealed envelope there, a whispered reminder that careers can rise if they don't ask too many questions. He didn't bribe. He invested. He made them feel like shareholders, and in a way, they were. Every official he paid became part of the network. Every signature signed in silence added another layer of protection, another layer of insulation between him and the world that claimed to chase him. It wasn't always cash. Sometimes it was a campaign donation with no return address. Sometimes it was a box delivered to a front desk with nothing but a Rolex inside. Sometimes it was the quiet disappearance of a journalist asking the wrong questions. Gratitude doesn't always look like money. Sometimes it looks like absence. When investigations started, they fizzled. When flights were flagged, paperwork vanished. Even when someone tried to speak, the air would tighten around them. Because power wasn't just in who feared you, it was in who protected you. And Amado had protectors wearing suits and pins and medals. Some drank wine at embassy dinners. Some gave speeches about justice. No one wanted to believe the man who moved tons of cocaine through the sky had friends in towers. But he did. And he treated those friendships like aircraft. Maintained them. Fuel them. Replace them when necessary. He never met most of them face to face. That wasn't the point. Influence didn't require presence. It required reliability. And Amado was always reliable. When a favor was asked, it was answered. When a door needed opening, it opened. No drama, no fingerprints. There were stories of a senator who owed his entire election to a plane that never got stopped. Of an airline board that agreed to look the other way for just one night and never stopped looking the other way since. Of a magistrate whose son came home safely from a kidnapping and never ruled against Amado's interests again. It wasn't blackmail, it was ecosystem, and at the center of it was a man who never shouted, never begged, never forced. He simply offered silence, and in the towers, silence bought everything. They didn't wear jerseys or tattoos. They didn't shout threats across crowded bars or spray bullets in every direction. Amado's men were not street soldiers. They were an army in tailored silence. Sicarios trained like flight crew. They didn't just carry weapons, they understood logistics, patterns, orders. They didn't get high on their own bravado. They got high on precision. Each man was handpicked, not just for skill, but for temperament. No hotheads, no loudmouths. They were the kind of men who cleaned their guns with the same focus as pilots cleaned windshields. They were raised on codes, internal radios, encrypted signals, hand gestures that meant retreat or remove or reposition. They didn't need to speak in slang. They spoke in numbers, in coordinates. If a hit was ordered, it wasn't personal. It was scheduled, timed, executed like a takeoff window. 2 men, 1 engine running, in and out before the echo of the first shot faded. They didn't linger. They didn't watch. They didn't film. They finished, then disappeared into the pattern. They weren't paid in fame. They were paid in permanence. A ranch deeded under another name, a new life waiting in Sonora, a plane ticket to anywhere but here. Loyalty wasn't bought, it was engineered. Some had been former military. Others were ex-police with clean records and darker resumes. But once they entered Amado's system, they were remade. They didn't answer to lieutenants. They answered to protocol. The mission was the master. The silence was sacred. They trained in private ranches disguised as airfields. Learned to move without sound, to strike without emotion, to vanish without residue. 1 man could take down 5 if the timing was right. And in Amado's world, timing was everything. There were rules. No collateral, no noise, no heroics. If a shot wasn't clean, it wasn't taken. If a target brought heat, the mission was scrubbed. These were not cowboys. They were instruments, precise, replaceable, revered. They didn't post photos. They didn't boast over drinks. Most had no known aliases, no fingerprints on any file. They were rumors wrapped in routine, and they liked it that way. Even other cartels didn't know their names. Only that when the Sky King sent his shadows, they arrived without sound, left without trace, and did not fail. Because they weren't soldiers for a warlord. They were gear in a clock that never stopped ticking, and that clock flew on wings. It started as a whisper of a route, Colombia to Juarez to the north. Others had done it before, slower, messier, bleeding money and bodies at every checkpoint. But Amado didn't want traffic. He wanted a highway, a superhighway, and he built one where others saw borders. It wasn't carved through jungle or desert. It was charted in altitude, planes that flew higher than radar, faster than response teams, quieter than suspicion. From the moment a kilo left a Colombian airstrip, it moved like a secret through the sky, never touching ground until it landed in territory that Amado controlled. No delays, no thefts, no excuses. He didn't just move cocaine. He moved systems, warehouses in Juarez that ran like postal hubs, crates rerouted with the accuracy of a logistics giant, drivers who didn't need to know what they were carrying, only that if they arrived 5 minutes late, they wouldn't be driving again. Some said it was easier to track a politician than track one of Amado's shipments. The product never sat still. It touched down. It passed hands. It vanished. Sometimes it was disguised in furniture, sometimes inside sealed truck tires, sometimes hidden in hollowed industrial equipment. But more often, it simply didn't need to be hidden, because by the time anyone knew where to look, it was already gone. Juarez became the spinal cord of the route. Not just a waypoint, but a refinery of movement. Men at terminals, updating flight paths in real time. Women with clipboards, checking manifests against codes that changed weekly. Security cameras that didn't just watch, they warned. And above all, planes. So many planes. Small, fast, often unmarked. Some registered to shell companies, some to nothing at all. A few were retrofitted commercial jets with hidden cargo bays, flying under false flight plans. Others were military grade, gifted through channels no one dared trace. Amado turned the skies into a blur of wings and wind and whispered landings. From the jungles of Medellin to the motel rooms of San Diego, the route pulsed like a living artery. No corners cut, no hands dirty unless it was necessary. Violence was last resort. Speed was the first. And the authorities? They knew something was happening. They just never knew where. Because every time they mapped a trail, it twisted. Every time they shut down a hub, 2 more bloomed. It was hydra-headed, fractal, alive. The cocaine didn't just move, it flowed. Because Amado didn't build a pipeline, he built a bloodstream. And America was already hooked. He never wore gold chains, never lit cigars with $100 bills. That was for the loud ones, the ones who needed the world to see them shine before they vanished. Amado preferred silk, tailored shirts, always buttoned high, imported shoes that touched tarmac more than marble. Not a single crease out of place, not a single color chosen by accident. There was something unsettling about his calm, about the way he could enter a room and lower the temperature without saying a word. His clothing whispered the same message his eyes did: control. Every stitch said he didn't need to be feared to be obeyed, only understood. He didn't dress like a narco. He dressed like a banker who never lost. Crisp cuffs, monogrammed initials, the occasional Rolex, but never the loud kind. The kind you only notice if you already know what it means. His wealth didn't announce itself. It nodded once, and you stepped aside. When others hosted parties, Amado scheduled meetings. When they toasted champagne, he sipped mineral water. Even his celebrations felt like mission briefings. No raised voices, no drunken laughter. Just strategy, softly spoken over polished wood tables in quiet rooms. The myth started not because of what he did, but how he looked while doing it. Calm in turbulence, polite when delivering ultimatums. A man who could order your disappearance while offering you a chair. His voice never rose, but it landed hard. Even his yes felt like a warning. Even his no felt like a door closing behind you. In Juarez, there were stories. People said if you saw Amado in person, it was already too late to change his mind. That he could tell if you were lying just by how you blinked. That his shirt cuffs were more ironed than most men's moral compasses. But it wasn't magic. It was discipline. He curated his presence like he curated his roots. Clean, efficient, quiet. No stain of chaos. No smell of blood, even when bodies fell. You could sit across from him and almost forget what business he was in. Almost. There were rumors he used the same tailor for 15 years. That his suits were cut in silence. Fittings done in private apartments under fake names. No photos. No measurements on paper. Just memory. Just trust. Because Amado knew something most kings forget. Power is not loud. It's a perfectly pressed collar, a jacket with no wrinkles, and an iron will under silk. They say it was never on any map. No address, no mailbox, no utility bill. Just a gravel road that curved too many times, passed too many decoys, and ended where GPS gave up. There, behind thick brush and iron gates, sat the kind of hacienda most men wouldn't believe unless they saw it. And even then they'd question if they were dreaming. Locals called it the place that doesn't exist. Ranchers swore the land was empty. Police turned their cars around before the final bend. And the pilots? They didn't speak of what they saw when flying low. They just kept flying. It wasn't grand in the way cartel estates are usually described. No tigers in cages, no fountains vomiting champagne. But it was grand in silence. Wide verandas, cold stone corridors that echoed even the softest footsteps, imported tile that stayed cool beneath the Sunday trees arranged like sentinels, security disguised as stillness. The guards weren't visible, but they were there, watching from shadows, behind mirror-tinted windows and wind-blown curtains. If you were invited in, you didn't ask who else was there. You didn't ask how many cameras. You didn't ask how far the tunnels went under your feet. You accepted the lemonade and answered only what was asked. Inside, it was colder than expected. Not unfriendly, just surgical. Files were kept in drawers with no labels. Meetings happened in rooms with no art. And when Amado sat at the head of the table, you understood it wasn't just a hacienda. It was the cockpit of an empire. Here is where the routes were redrawn, where entire governments were bent by phone calls that lasted fewer than 3 minutes, where silence carried more weight than a loaded gun. In this house that didn't officially exist, he dreamed bigger than any border, not just shipments but networks, not just dollars but currencies. He didn't want to be king of Juarez. He wanted to be the man who erased the need for kings. The hacienda had no helicopter pad, yet helicopters came and went. It had no guards at the front gate, yet no one entered without being expected. It had no addresses, yet it was the center of everything. Some said it was built over old bones, a hacienda on haunted land. Others said it wasn't built at all, it had always been there, waiting for the man who understood that true power doesn't need to shout. Because in a world where everyone is loud, the one who whispers becomes myth, and myths don't need addresses. There were men who built empires just to be seen. Flashbulbs at the clubs, interviews with half smiles, gold chains catching the light just right. But Amado Carrillo Fuentes didn't want to be seen. He wanted to be remembered without ever being recognized. And so, he made himself a ghost long before he ever died. From the earliest days, he treated cameras like weapons, not because he was shy, but because he understood what a single photograph could cost. A lens didn't just steal a face, it offered it to the world. It archived it. It gave it shape and time and vulnerability. So Amado vanished from the frame before the shutter clicked. Over and over, again and again. There are more photographs of his planes than of him, more images of his runways than his eyes. Even the government struggled. They recycled the same few blurry headshots, taken decades earlier when he was still half boy, half shadow. By the time his empire stretched across continents, the man at its center had become vapor. Reporters begged for images. Agents passed sketches drawn from memory, never quite matching. Surveillance teams trailed men they thought were him, only to find decoys, doubles, ghosts in tailored jackets. He played with perception like others played with dice, always one step ahead, always behind a curtain no one could pull back. Some whispered he had surgery early on not to look better, but to look forgettable. Others said he dyed his hair every week, altered his walk, practiced new accents in empty rooms. There were rumors that he sometimes sat in public parks wearing sunglasses from gas stations, watching the world pass him by while his name filled headlines he never read. His face was currency, and he kept it buried. Inside the cartel, only a few ever looked him in the eye, and those who did often described something strange, not anger, not warmth, but stillness, as if the man had already left the room, even while sitting in it. When his empire peaked, he had the money to live like a god, but gods don't get caught on film. So he became legend the old-fashioned way, by disappearing in plain sight. To the world, Amado was a name attached to weight, speed, and fear, but not a face. Not really, because in his world, being invisible was not a weakness. It was the highest form of power, and he wore it better than any crown. He knew what bullets could do, but he also knew what money could build. He learned early that a gun can silence a man, but a gift can silence a village. So while others built their legacy on blood, Amado layered his in concrete, stained glass, and whispered prayers. In towns too small to matter to the government, he mattered most. A new roof for the church, fresh paint for the school, ambulances that arrived without questions, funded by hands no one dared name. He gave without ceremony, without signature. The priest would nod, the mayor would look away, and the people would line up to receive blessings wrapped in envelopes. Hospitals that never saw federal pesos found themselves with new machines. Medicine appeared, wards expanded, whole wings were named after no one, but everyone knew. In back rooms and confession booths, the truth passed like gospel. The man who flew without wings was watching over them. Some called it laundering. Others called it protection. The old women in church just called it divine. They lit candles and whispered for his safety, even as they clutched rosaries with trembling hands. Because who else paid for their son's surgery? Who else sent a coffin when their daughter didn't come home? In Sinaloa, in Juarez, in the stretches of desert where law came late and left early, Amado's bribes felt like blessings. And maybe that's how he wanted it. Not love, not fear, but debt. Spiritual, moral, permanent. He didn't ask for statues. He didn't need praise. But they built them anyway. Small shrines tucked behind altars, photos hidden in frames, candles flickering beside the Virgin. He became a rumor with wings, a man who dealt in kilograms and kindness, whose mercy came with strings no one could see, but everyone felt. Even funerals paid for, arranged, attended by men in black suits who never said his name. He honored the dead better than some honored the living, and with each act, he stitched himself deeper into the soul of the streets. He wasn't a politician, he didn't campaign, but he won hearts, not with speeches, but with silence followed by salvation. And in a country where the line between sin and sanctity is sometimes no thicker than a handshake, Amado played both priest and devil. He built cathedrals with blood money, and people knelt in them, crying tears of gratitude, because sometimes a man doesn't have to be good to be called a saint. He just has to give better than God. They said the planes moved like ghosts. No radar pings, no warning hums, just sky, and then dust, and then money. The locals didn't call it trafficking, they called it weather. When Amado's jets passed overhead, children were told to close their eyes and pray, not out of fear, but reverence, because what fell from the sky wasn't just cocaine, it was prophecy. Out in the desert, old men swore they saw wings on fire slicing the clouds, not flames from engines, something else, something holy or cursed. They'd sit outside their shacks, sip bitter coffee, and speak of the devil's fleet. One man claimed he saw a plane land without touching the ground, said it hovered like a sin waiting to be named. By the early 90s, the stories weren't just whispered, they were sung. Corridos spoke of steel birds that carried dreams north and brought silence south. Whole villages memorized the names of pilots they never met. There were no parades, but there were legends of single nights that changed everything. Entire valleys waking up rich, just because the sky had grumbled in the dark. Customs agents started to wonder if they were chasing wind. Pilots swore the routes didn't exist. Maps were outdated before they were printed. Airports showed no records. Yet the dust on the tarmac told a different story, one that smelled faintly of jet fuel and fear. No one could match his scale. He didn't just fly cocaine, he choreographed it. Each aircraft a verse in a deadly song, each route a thread in an invisible web. There were times when 3 planes would land in 3 countries within the same hour, all traced back to the same hand, and that hand was never visible, only the aftermath. Wings of smoke, they called them, because they vanished too fast to be caught, too smooth to be real. Some said the cocaine traveled faster than the news of its arrival. By the time officials were alerted, it had already changed hands twice and crossed another border. It wasn't magic, it wasn't luck, it was mastery. Amado didn't believe in ghosts, but he built a network that behaved like one, untouchable, silent, omnipresent. The fields kept growing, the factories kept refining, but it was the sky that made it sacred. Once a load took flight, it became more than product. It became myth. It flew in on the devil's back, one man said, shaking his head beneath a rusted awning, and the others just nodded, because how else could you explain something so terrifying and so perfect? They say he didn't sleep like most men, not in beds, not in silence. He slept in maps, his head resting against flight paths, his dreams stitched between longitude and altitude. While others counted sheep, Amado counted seconds between takeoff and landing. In the heart of his compound, one room stayed lit at all hours. A wall of maps, dotted with pins and tape, charts and wind patterns, air corridors that pulsed like veins. Every new runway was a whispered secret. Every closed airstrip, a temporary wound. He knew the skies the way sailors once knew stars. With reverence, with obsession. Some said he would lie down only after checking fuel reports and weather data from 5 countries. That he would doze off murmuring airport codes, runway lengths, engine specs. He didn't dream of women or gold. He dreamt of storms that could hide a shipment, of jet streams that could shave off 5 minutes, of satellites that might catch his shadow. His bodyguards joked about it once until they saw the circles under his eyes, until they realized he hadn't blinked during an entire briefing. He would go 72 hours without rest, eyes darting over manifests, recalculating margins, predicting betrayals before they happened, not because he feared death, but because the sky had no room for errors. He didn't trust pilots to plan. He did it himself, not because he wanted control, but because he was the only one who saw the whole picture. Others ran cartels like kingdoms. He ran his like a meteorologist. Anticipation was his weapon. Patience, his shield. Even when he closed his eyes, the map never left his mind. He'd mutter in his sleep latitude, altitude, call signs. Once, an associate swore he heard him mumbling coordinates and woke him, panicked that something had gone wrong. Amado opened one eye and said, "If it had gone wrong, I'd already be dead." Then, for his else, sometimes he'd fall asleep mid-conversation, slumped against a chart, his fingers still tracing a route across Belize. He never wore pajamas, only suits, crisp, dark, silent, like he might have to rise at any second and redirect an entire fleet. The irony was cruel. For a man with everything, sleep became the luxury he couldn't afford, not because of fear, but because of ambition. There was always a faster route, always a cleaner lane through the clouds, and if he didn't find it first, someone else would. He didn't sleep in beds. He slept in motion, because for Amado Carrillo Fuentes, rest was not escape. It was strategy. The boy sat at the edge of the bed, small legs swinging, voice soft as dust. "Why don't we have photos?" he asked. Amado didn't look up right away. He was studying a flight manifest, some corridor over Chiapas, something he'd seen 1,000 times and still didn't trust. He let the question sit in the room, like a spilled drink no one cleaned up. Then, finally, without shifting his gaze, he said, "Because ghosts don't leave shadows. It wasn't meant to hurt." It was the kind of answer he thought a son might admire one day. Clever, icy, legendary. But the boy didn't smile. He just looked down, nodded, and didn't ask again. Amado wasn't cruel. He loved his children in the only way he knew how. Distance was a shield. Silence was a kind of protection. You don't draw targets around what you treasure. You bury it deep. You make sure no lens, no enemy, no informant even knows it exists. Birthdays came and went with packages, not presents. School plays were missed. Hospital visits were made by quiet men with briefcases full of apologies. His name paid the tuition, paved the driveways, filled the pantries. But his voice was an echo, always coming from the other room, or the other country, or the other end of a cryptic phone line. He had rules. No pictures, no names outside the house, no questions about what he did. He told himself it was for their safety. Maybe it was. But the deeper truth, he didn't know how to be a father. Not really. He knew how to build routes through the sky, how to move tons of powder without touching a single grain. But bedtime stories, first steps, family photos on the mantle, he was a genius in the air. But on the ground, he drifted. There's one story. One the housekeepers still whisper. His youngest daughter had a nightmare. Woke up screaming about planes falling, about men without faces. And for one moment, one fragile hour before dawn, Amado sat beside her bed. He held her hand. He sang something under his breath, an old folk song his mother once sang. And when she fell asleep, he stayed, just sat there, still, watching her breathe. Then he stood, quiet as a shadow, and walked out before the sun could rise. That's who he was. A man who built empires in the clouds, but left silence in the rooms that mattered most. A man whose children loved a myth more than a memory. A man whose son, years later, would still ask the question not to accuse but to understand. Why don't we have photos? Because fathers like him don't pose. They disappear. Somewhere deep in the desert, under the cruel silence of the northern sun, Amado Carrillo Fuentes built a house that didn't trust itself. No one remembers the blueprints, because there were none. No architects with flashy pens or government stamps, just whispers exchanged in the dead of night, a mason paid in gold and fear, a carpenter who never saw the same hallway twice, a welder who swore the windows breathed when you turned your back. The mansion had no corners. That was the first rule. Every room flowed into the next, with a strange, liquid geometry. Walls curved like riverbanks, hallways bent without logic. You could walk for hours and never be sure where you began. The ceilings sloped like waves about to crash. Even the mirrors were rounded. No angles, no shadows. Nowhere for a man to crouch, wait, and strike. Because by then, Amado no longer feared lawmen. He feared the ones who called him Sir. Paranoia doesn't announce itself with a scream. It drips. First, a glance over the shoulder, then 2 guards instead of 1, then the sound of a phone left ringing just a second too long. By the time he started designing the mansion, he already knew what betrayal smelled like. It had the scent of gun oil and cologne. It whispered in boardrooms and airports. It walked in smiling and left with your blood. So he built a home where no one could ambush him. No dead ends, no trap angles. Every wall was designed to reflect sound, to echo footsteps. He memorized which tiles creaked. Installed false doors, panic rooms, disappearing hallways. Visitors said the house seemed to move when you blinked. Some say he slept in a different room each night. Others say he didn't sleep at all. There was a dining room with no chairs, a living room with no windows, a study with a one-way mirror and no books. Even the chapel, yes, he had one, was built like a spiral, so the priest could never see who sat behind him. The guards outside rotated every 12 hours. Not because he needed them fresh, but because he trusted no one longer than that. And still, he never felt safe. Because paranoia isn't cured by architecture. It only changes its shape. You build a house with no corners, and soon, your own mind starts to curve. You hear footsteps in round rooms. You see threats and smiles. You become the only shadow left to fear. Amado Carrillo Fuentes flew above nations, but on the ground, he walked hallways shaped like nightmares. He built a fortress no one could sneak through, but in the end, the enemy didn't come through the door. It came from the mirror. The mirror never blinked. It just watched him. Amado Carrillo Fuentes would sometimes stand in front of the glass and say nothing for long minutes. No guards, no phones. Just him, his reflection, and the silence of a house that curved like a maze built by ghosts. He wore suits that whispered wealth, but not once did he look at the clothes. He looked at the eyes. Always the eyes, searching for something that might have once been human, but the mirror never gave it back. He wasn't a man anymore. Not really. He was a system of roots, a flight schedule written in blood, a ghost riding thermals from Bogota to Dallas. His fingerprints were on control towers and funeral homes, on satellite images and border station logs, but never on people, not anymore. The face in the mirror had grown thinner, sharper, not aged, just more abstract. Like the more power he gained, the more the man inside him faded. The eyes weren't tired. They were calculating, cold. But behind them, something small had begun to twitch. A shadow of doubt, a flicker of something he didn't recognize, or maybe something he no longer wanted to. He asked himself quietly, always silently, where did I go? Was he the boy who once looked up at planes with awe? Or the apprentice who memorized radar codes like poetry? Or had he become the roots themselves, the invisible veins pulsing with contraband and money and death? There were nights he would lift his hand and mimic the motion of flight, fingers slicing through the air like wings. And still, the reflection followed. Perfect, empty, a man, but not quite. Maybe that's what happens when you disappear on purpose, when every identity is borrowed, every document forged, every step calculated for survival. Maybe you vanish a little at a time until the only proof you were real is a blurry face on a wanted poster and a name whispered in courtrooms. He had outflown bullets, outthought generals, outspent governments, but the mirror couldn't be bribed. It just stared back, and on that night, one of the last before the end, it blinked. Only once. A trick of the eye, maybe, or the weight of exhaustion pressing hallucinations into the edges of his vision. But he stepped back, slowly, heart suddenly louder than the silence. He never returned to that mirror again, because deep down, he feared what it might show next time. Not the face of a king, but the truth that there was no one left inside. He once said clouds were the only thing that didn't lie. You couldn't bribe them, couldn't track them, couldn't shoot through them and expect to hit anything. They just floated soft, indifferent, eternal. That morning, Amado Carrillo Fuentes flew alone. Not alone in the strictest sense. There was a pilot, of course. There was always someone else in the plane, but in his mind, it was just him and the sky. He watched the sunlight cut through the mist as the Sierra Madre unraveled beneath them, jagged and ancient like a sleeping god's spine. The plane hummed steady, obedient. Not a military jet, not one of his cocaine mules. This was personal. Something sleek, elegant, white leather interior. No chatter. He raised a hand and let it hover near the window, fingers tracing the shape of a cloud as they passed through it. For a second, it looked like he touched it. He smiled, a rare thing. The kind that didn't reach the eyes but still cracked the shell. For a breath of a moment, he was only a man, not the Sky King, not the architect of roots and empires, just a boy from Sinaloa flying too close to heaven. Then the call came in, encrypted, one of the 3 numbers he still trusted. But he didn't flinch, didn't blink, just turned his head slightly and listened. The voice on the other end was short, clipped, careful, no names. Just 2 words. There's a leak. The silence that followed was louder than the jet engines. He didn't ask who. He already knew. He didn't ask where. He knew that too. The tone of the voice told him it wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a mistake. Someone had opened a door, and now wind was rushing through it. His hand dropped from the window. Peace had lasted exactly 7 minutes. He gave no orders. Not yet. That would come later, when the plane touched down and his people fell into motion like trained neurons responding to pain. Right now, he sat back in the leather seat, eyes still on the clouds but no longer seeing them. The price of touching the sky is that you always have to come back down, and sometimes the fall starts with a whisper. He used to say the sky was his cathedral, boundless, silent, obedient. But now, there was static in it. It started subtly. Planes that didn't follow their expected paths, interference on the comms, shadowy silhouettes at high altitude that loitered too long before vanishing into cloud banks. Radar pings where there should have been none. The sky, once his sanctuary, had started whispering back. The DEA was never stupid. They were slow, sure, underfunded, undercut, sometimes tragically overconfident, but not stupid. After years of chasing ghosts across runways and deserts, they had finally caught a scent, not of cocaine but of coordination. Someone up high had noticed the pattern. They didn't see Amado, not exactly, but they saw what he moved, and so the Sky King found himself watched. Mexican intelligence was worse. Less predictable, more personal. They didn't play by rules, not foreign ones, not even their own. One day they'd offer you breakfast, the next they'd wire your car to scream before it exploded. And somewhere along the chain, someone inside began leaking not out of fear, but greed. Loyalty wasn't cheap anymore, and Amado had taught too many men how to think like businessmen. Meanwhile, Colombia had problems of its own. The cartels there saw Juarez not just as a hub, but as a choke point. If Amado controlled it too cleanly, too efficiently, he could start naming prices. And that made him a threat, not just to governments, but to tradition. The old ways didn't fly planes. They bled. He didn't bleed. Not yet. But the circling had begun. Federal agents started raiding warehouses too precisely. Flights that once passed undetected now met unexpected turbulence. Military patrols, rerouted air corridors, anonymous tips. Even the airports whispered differently. And pilots, those quiet, loyal men with war scars and sealed mouths, began disappearing. Some to interrogation, others to bribes. And still, Amado didn't panic. He adjusted, shifted the routes, killed the leaks, moved the pieces, but he could feel it, like pressure in the lungs at high altitude. This wasn't turbulence. This was weather, the kind that never clears. There's a moment every pilot fears when the plane is too heavy to land and too light to crash. Amado had reached that moment, not in the sky, but in life. He had climbed so high, built so much, moved so fast, that now there was no runway long enough to hold him. He used to be a whisper, a name passed between border agents who couldn't prove what they knew, a ghost in flight logs, a phantom in hangars. But now the whisper had turned into a roar. Customs officers talked in low tones with shaking hands. Politicians who once took his money now shifted in their chairs when his name came up. The maps had started showing red zones around places he used to fly through like smoke. It wasn't just the DEA. It wasn't just rival cartels or the occasional ambitious journalist. It was the scale of it all. Hundreds of aircraft, thousands of routes, money that could tilt cities sideways, power that didn't just corrupt it, restructured. You couldn't hide that in plain sight anymore. Even the airspace had started rejecting him. One airport suddenly had mechanical failures and couldn't open. Another reported a suspicious cargo list and locked down. Pilots whispered that someone was watching from towers they couldn't see. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built his empire in the sky, and now the sky had begun to close around him like a fist. Every move triggered alarms. Every phone call could be tapped. Every trusted man could be flipped. The routes he once orchestrated like a symphony now groaned under the weight of expectation. Too many shipments. Too many mouths. Too much risk. It was no longer about getting away with it, it was about surviving it. He still flew, but the joy was gone. The freedom had curdled into tension. He no longer felt the wind, just the pressure. Every takeoff felt like a countdown. Every landing a negotiation with gravity and fate. He wasn't running yet, but he could feel the edge of the runway approaching. Fast. They were not loud deaths. No bodies in public squares. No warning messages carved into flesh. These were quiet ends. Sudden absences. Empty seats at meetings. Phones that rang forever without answers. The first man found had once toasted champagne beside him, not in a club, but in a control tower, celebrating a shipment that slipped past 5 radars and 2 air patrols. Now he lay in the back seat of a burned-out sedan, jaw broken, hands still clutching a folder no one would ever read. The second was found floating just outside Matamoros, face missing, wallet intact. He had kept the books, not for the money, but for the legacy. He had believed there needed to be a record, proof that they had done something impossible. That belief killed him. By the time the third body dropped, no one called it coincidence anymore. These weren't hits, they were deletions. Whole men erased like corrupted data. People who had once been trusted. People who once called him compadre, now reduced to crime scene tape and rumors. Amado didn't cry. He didn't flinch. But something behind his eyes shifted. He had always known this world took what it wanted, but now it was taking memory. Familiar voices, gone. Laughs from old airstrips, gone. Details about early routes, codes, passwords, favorite safe houses, gone. Dead men don't leak secrets. That was the point. Still, it didn't feel like power. It felt like sealing hatches in a sinking ship. He began to speak less, not because he feared betrayal, because he feared nostalgia. Too many memories came wrapped in blood now. Too many smiles ended in silence. His men noticed. The jokes disappeared. Orders came in shorter sentences. Trust was still given, but on lease. Everyone was on a timer now. It wasn't fear that gripped the organization. It was gravity. The realization that they had climbed so high, with so much weight, that anything less than precision would send them all falling. And those first few falls, they had already started. It was supposed to be routine, a night flight from Sonora to a strip outside El Paso, skimming under radar, cargo secure, crew loyal. They had done this run a dozen times before, maybe more. But something in the air that night felt off. The clouds were too low, the winds too sharp, the silence too loud. Somewhere over the Sierra, the radio crackled, then cut. Ground control tried to re-establish contact, but the plane was already gone. Not shot down, not intercepted, just gone. Minutes later, a fire lit up the side of a mountain like a signal flare from hell. Locals said it sounded like thunder that refused to end. The wreckage was found before sunrise, wings sheared, tail buried in rock, packages still strapped in tight, unopened, untouched, like the cargo had braced for impact. But the pilot wasn't there. His seatbelt was unlatched. No blood, no body. Just the imprint of a man who left without saying goodbye. At first, there was hope. Maybe he had ejected. Maybe he had crawled away into the dark to find help. Maybe he was hiding. Maybe he was smart. But Amado didn't like maybes. By the end of the second day, that hope soured into something sharper. The pilot had been with him for years, trained, trusted, paid in silence and sky. But trust in this world had altitude limits. If he had survived, and if he had talked, the empire wouldn't crack. It would burn. So the call was made. No bounty. No search party. Just a soft order passed through 2 phones and 1 voice. By the end of the week, the pilot's name was a whisper. No one said twice. Some say he was found. Others say he was never meant to be. That he walked away from the flames and into a new life, in a country that doesn't ask questions and pays well for answers. That maybe, just maybe, he was the only man who ever escaped the Sky King alive. But those are just stories. The kind you tell when a plane becomes a coffin and a name becomes a liability. The wings had made them rich, had made them ghosts, but now they came with a price. And sometimes that price was not measured in dollars or kilos. Sometimes the price was a man who knew how to land, but not where to run. The sky was no longer empty. Once, it had been his playground, a vast ocean of possibilities charted only by him and a handful of ghost pilots. But now the air was crowded. Too many eyes, too many ears, too many machines that didn't blink, didn't sleep, and never forgot. He could feel it not in the papers, not in the news, but in the rhythm of his own maps. Routes that once stretched like open arms now curled in on themselves. Landing strips went dark. Hangars that once buzzed with quiet confidence sat locked and silent. Someone was watching. Maybe everyone was. It wasn't just the DEA anymore. Now there were drones that moved like wasps, small enough to miss, fast enough to catch. Satellites hovered above his routes, tracing patterns, building cases. The very air he had mastered was being turned against him, pixel by pixel, mile by mile. And worse, men who had once looked away were now squinting in his direction. He started hearing it in whispers, over static-filled radios, in half-finished sentences between nervous lieutenants. A border agent's cousin disappeared. A mayor's plane was searched. An air traffic controller fled to Belize with his family and a briefcase full of secrets. The winds were changing, and he didn't like the direction. Some say it was technology that closed in on him. Others say it was the men who made promises they couldn't keep. A handshake made years ago in a smoky room now meant nothing under fluorescent lights in Washington or Mexico City. Deals that once bought invisibility now only delayed the inevitable. Even the judges were blinking slower. He called a meeting, not a large one. Just a few faces he still believed in. Maps spread across the table like open wounds, each route marked, each airport circled. each risk redrawn. Then, silence. The kind of silence that comes when even the boldest men realize they're not outrunning the storm anymore. One of them asked, "So, what now?" He didn't answer right away, just stared at the lines. The same lines he had flown above, the same ones that had built his empire. Now, they looked like veins drying up, collapsing inward, like the body of a god that had flown too close, too long. Finally, he spoke. "Every map ends." And that was it. No rage, no panic, just a quiet understanding. The air, once his crown, was becoming his cage. For years his reflection belonged only to shadows. No snapshots at weddings, no candid photos on vacations. Not even surveillance ever caught him clearly. Amado had mastered the art of erasure. He was a man known by whispers and wreckage, never by a face, until now. It started with a mistake. Maybe a careless glance at an airport camera. Maybe a dinner in a too public place. Or maybe someone he trusted betrayed him with a flash. Whatever it was, the result was the same. A grainy image, low resolution, high value surfaced. Then another, and then another. The agencies pounced. They ran it through software, filtered the noise, compared ears and eyebrows and the slope of a jaw. And just like that, the ghost had a face. Not a name, not an arrest yet, but a face. And that was enough to start the clock. In Juarez, he stared at the printed image. It was him, barely, but it was enough. Enough to make every checkpoint, every border, every customs desk tremble with potential. Enough to make old allies nervous. He'd built his empire on silence, but now his silence had a portrait. He didn't smash the photo. He didn't burn it. He just stared, long and quiet. The same face he'd avoided in hotel mirrors. The same face his son barely remembered. The same face the world had now cold, still, forever linked to too many bodies buried in desert heat. From that moment on, he moved differently. Slower, tighter. He began to sleep in different cities each night. His pilots no longer flew with real names. His safe houses grew smaller, simpler, and he started to wonder not when it would end, but how. A man like Amado doesn't fear violence. He fears recognition, and now that fear was stitched to his skin. When he passed mirrors, he looked away. When he passed crowds, he tucked his chin. Even the sky felt heavier, as if the clouds themselves now knew who he was. They didn't have his fingerprints. They didn't have his voice. But they had his eyes, frozen mid-blink, staring back from a wall of wanted men. And in that blink, everything shifted. He was no longer the man who controlled the air. He was the man being hunted through it. The body had become a liability, not because it was frail. Amado was still lean, still sharp, but because it was recognizable. The face that once ruled without being seen had finally been seen. And now, it had to disappear. Not hide, not run, transform. This wasn't paranoia. It was calculation. The same way he studied radar sweeps and wind patterns, he now studied cheekbones and skin elasticity. He didn't want to vanish. He wanted to be reborn. Entirely different. A new man with a new passport, new fingerprints, a new smile stitched by precision and pain. He found the surgeons in Mexico City. Not the ones with ads on bus stops. These were the ones who never used names, only initials and bank codes. Their offices didn't have signs. Their patients didn't have aftercare. Once you walked out, you were someone else or you weren't walking at all. Amado brought cash, then brought more, then brought protection. Guards stood outside in silence, unaware that behind sterile doors, their boss was slowly being peeled and reassembled like a myth carved from flesh. The procedures were brutal, cartilage broken and repositioned, jawline sculpted, eye corners stretched into unfamiliar tension. At one point, he couldn't speak for 3 days. He didn't need to. The surgeons already knew. This was not a request. This was survival. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He simply breathed through clenched teeth and thought of all the countries where he could walk free as a man no one had ever seen. The irony was sharp. The man who had spent his life hiding now had to make himself unrecognizable just to stay hidden, a mask of his own choosing, a plastic god, molded by fear and funded by empires. Outside, the world was closing in. The DEA, the Mexican federales, the whispers from Colombia, all circling tighter. But inside that clinic, Amado believed he was winning. He would walk out untouched, reborn. But plastic gods do not age, and they do not heal like mortals. Something went wrong, or maybe everything did. A clot, an infection, a breath that came too late. No one knows exactly when his heart stopped, but it did. Quietly, surgically, the body on the table looked like him and didn't, like a dream blurred at the edges. The Sky King, grounded not by bullets, not by betrayal, but by the weight of his own design. The final disguise cost him everything. They met him in a hallway that didn't exist on any blueprint. Not in an office, not in a clinic. Just a bare room behind a service elevator in Mexico City. No names, no small talk. One surgeon wore gloves before he shook hands. The other kept looking at the clock, not because he was in a hurry, but because he knew this job would change everything, especially if it failed. Amado didn't blink. He had come prepared. The duffel bag on the table held more cash than most men see in 3 lifetimes. It wasn't a bribe. It was proof of silence. Once they touched it, they were no longer doctors. They were ghosts tied to a promise. The contract wasn't written, but it was understood. He needed a new face. Not a younger one, not a prettier one. Just different, untraceable. A face that could step onto a plane, pass through customs, and never be flagged. A face that could order wine in Rome, drift through Madrid, disappear into a quiet life in Buenos Aires, all without drawing a second glance. They studied his bone structure, took measurements, murmured to each other in coded phrases. They knew what was at stake. This wasn't vanity. This was war. The DEA was closing in. Rivals were talking. Informants were turning. The world was shrinking, and his reflection was now a liability. The operating room was stripped of identity. No cameras, no assistants, no records. Just 2 men in masks, and 1 man on the table, who had once commanded an empire from the clouds. They began the cutting at midnight. Every incision was a betrayal of the old self. Skin pulled, cheekbones fractured and reset, fat relocated, the nose thinned and shortened, a jaw reshaped with cold precision. They moved like engineers, not healers. This was not about saving a life. This was about erasing one and replacing it with a myth. He didn't scream. He didn't flinch, not even when the pain cracked through the anesthesia. Somewhere in his mind, he was already living the life that waited on the other side. A life where he was no longer Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Sky King, but someone else entirely, just a man with a passport, a villa, and silence. But flesh does not always obey money. Something shifted. Some vessel tightened. A breath caught where it shouldn't have. The machines began to panic. The doctors tried to stay calm, but their hands moved faster than they had all night. And then stillness. The contract was fulfilled. The face was changed, but the man behind it was gone. The surgeons looked at each other, saying nothing. There were no refunds in this line of work. Just shadows, just silence, and a body that no longer looked like anyone. The lights in the room weren't surgical white. They were dim, yellowed, humming faintly. Not a hospital, not even a clinic. Just a sealed room with a generator, 2 surgeons, and a man whose life depended on a secret. Not a new face, the new face. The one that would free him from the hunt, the headlines, the weight of the skies he once ruled. He laid down without ceremony. No prayers, no hesitation, just silence. The surgeons had done this before, not exactly this, but close enough to fake new identities, swap faces for fugitives, erase men like ink on a page. But this wasn't just cosmetic. This was resurrection. Death as disguise. The most expensive vanishing act in cartel history. The table was stainless steel, cold against his back. But it wasn't clean, not in the way a hospital table should be. Maybe not physically, maybe just symbolically. Because nothing about this operation was sterile. Everything carried risk. Infection? Yes. Complication, of course. But also betrayal. Panic. Exposure. They started with the anesthetic. He went under fast, too fast, one of the surgeons thought. The other noticed a tremor in his hands as he reached for the scalpel. Sweat formed under the mask. This wasn't routine anymore. This was myth in motion. The first incision was steady. The second, not quite. And then the bleeding started. Not unusual, but not normal either. A clot where there shouldn't have been one. A pressure spike. A rhythm gone wild. They adjusted oxygen, checked the pulse. Then the machine gave a single long tone. One surgeon cursed. The other hesitated. He was flatlining. But was he? Maybe that was the plan. Maybe the drugs were meant to slow the heart to a whisper. Fool the machines. Fool the world. A death certificate bought in advance. A coffin waiting for a body that wasn't really gone. Or maybe it really did go wrong. Maybe the veins closed too fast. The lungs drowned in their own silence. The body rejected the idea of becoming someone else. Maybe his heart, so used to flying, simply refused to be grounded. Within minutes, the body was wrapped, taken not to a morgue but to a room with no record. A phone call was made, then another. Some say the real surgeons disappeared. Others claim they stayed in Mexico for years, untouched, protected by favors already paid. Was it a botched surgery? Or was it the perfect exit? The answer depends on who you ask. Some say he died on that table. Others say he walked out days later, bandaged, unrecognizable, reborn. And every year since, the rumors take flight. Because when a man builds his empire in the sky, you never really know where he lands. The machines hissed softly, then went still. The pulse that had filled the room like a quiet metronome, steady, commanding, alive, was gone. One long tone stretched across the air like a line drawn through a name. Flat, unbroken, final, or not. The surgeon stood over the body, gloved hands frozen. One looked to the monitor, the other to the door. No alarms rang. No nurses rushed in. Just silence thick enough to bend the air. The kind of silence that means either something has ended or something has just begun. They declared him dead. Complications from surgery, they would later say. A rare reaction to anesthesia. The official story was written before the body cooled. A name known across continents now had a death certificate. The Sky King, grounded forever. But some things don't fit. The room had no cameras. The body was never seen by outside officials. The funeral, when it came, was closed casket, and fast. Too fast for a man of that magnitude. They say the men who wheeled him out weren't hospital staff. They say the body was lighter than it should have been. They say the priest never said his name out loud. And what of the surgeons? One disappeared entirely. The other bought property in a foreign country under a different name. No one knows who paid them. Only that they were paid in advance, in full, and in silence. The papers ran the headlines. Drug lord dead, kingpin falls, Mexico breathes. But behind those headlines, questions piled up. Why no autopsy? Why no photographs? Why no fingerprints confirmed? And then the sightings began. A man in Chile, walking with his collar turned up. A shadow in Argentina who always paid in cash. A whisper in Spain, he's here, he's different, but it's him. They all ended the same way, with silence. Because if he was alive, he didn't want to be found. And if he was dead, he was better at hiding than anyone ever imagined. There's a story that on the night he supposedly died, the lights at the airstrip in Juarez flickered once, then again, as if someone had sent a final signal skyward. They say the dead don't leave shadows, but this one did. Long, shifting, and always moving just beyond reach. Was it death, or was it ascension? A new face, a new name, a new sky. In the end, only one thing is certain. The room went silent, and the pulse vanished. They found the first one in a shallow ditch, somewhere between Mexico City and nowhere. His hands were gone, his teeth smashed, the face unrecognizable, almost sculpted into nothing. But the message was clear. It was him, the man who'd touched the Sky King's flesh, who'd seen what no one was meant to see. The second took longer, a week, maybe 2. But death has a schedule when power demands silence. He was found slumped over in a hotel room in Sonora, throat slit so clean it looked almost surgical. On the mirror, scrawled in something dark and dried, were the words, "No gods above the clouds." No arrests were made, no investigations lingered. The news whispered it, then moved on. But everyone knew. This was not about justice. It was about erasure. They say both men were paid in advance, but they never got to spend it. New homes bought in foreign countries suddenly sat empty, bank accounts frozen, passports burned, as if the money itself had been cursed, or worse, reclaimed. The message rippled quietly through the underground. Loyalty ends at the scalpel. No one is sacred. No one is safe. Not even the hands that try to remake a face. But some believe it wasn't revenge. Some believe it was control. That if Amado Carrillo Fuentes did survive the operation, he needed insurance. Silence sealed not with contracts but with corpses. Too fewer men alive to ever say, "Yes, he lived." Whispers grew louder in the shadows. Had Amado planned it this way? A death faked so perfectly, it required real ones to sell the lie? Was the Sky King hiding in plain sight while the world grieved his exit? Or had something gone wrong on that table, and someone else had seized the aftermath for their own gain? Whatever the truth, one thing became certain. The past was being buried, piece by piece, body by body. And the surgeons, men of science, of skill, of scalpel and stitch, became just another page torn out of the story. Their names vanished from hospital rolls. Their homes were looted and left to rot. Families asked questions, but never too loudly, because the message wasn't just for the cartels. It was for the world. There is no healing a ghost, and those who try, they are the first to die. The casket was closed before it arrived, sealed tight, guarded like gold. No one from the press was allowed near it. No photos were taken, no fingerprints checked. Just a quick ceremony, an official word, and dirt thrown over a box too silent to answer back. The death certificate said Amado Carrillo Fuentes died on the operating table, complications from plastic surgery. But no one who mattered believed that. Not really. Not the agents who had chased him across skies. Not the rivals who had feared his rise. Not even the mourners who gathered at the grave. There were whispers. Always whispers. Some said the face was too smooth. Others said the weight was wrong. That the body was bloated, unrecognizable, perhaps not even cold when they claimed it dead. And yet the burial went forward without question because asking meant risking more bodies in more graves. It wasn't long before sightings started. A man in Havana with the same walk. A figure in Argentina paying with untraceable cash. A shadow in Madrid that moved like a ghost but paid like a king. Always too fast to follow. Always just out of reach. Always him, but maybe not. The myth began to stretch its wings. They called him the Sky King for how he ruled the air. But now they said he had become part of it. A legend that no longer needed flesh to exist. Dead or not dead, it didn't matter. What mattered was the fear, the silence, the idea that Amado could still be watching from above. The grave in Sinaloa became a kind of altar, not one for prayers but for questions. Young men left offerings, old men left warnings. No one lingered too long. The tombstone didn't say much, just a name. No epitaph, no dates, as if even the stone was unsure what story to tell. And still, every now and then, someone would drive by late at night, a figure in a black car with tinted windows, never exiting, just pausing, watching, as if checking to see if the myth was still intact. Because that's the thing about a coffin filled with doubt, it never stays buried. It floats, it travels, it follows, and long after the dirt has settled, the legend keeps breathing, quietly, boldly, in silence that sounds a lot like footsteps, or the hum of a private jet far above the clouds. The world moved on, but something about the silence felt staged. There were no funeral photos, no weeping mother on the news, no trembling brother offering vague words of closure, no family statements, no leaked footage, just the announcement, whispered once, printed twice, and then swallowed by smoke. Reporters tried. Cameras rolled. Microphones reached like desperate arms into government buildings and cartel strongholds. But no one grabbed hold. No one confirmed, denied, or dared to remember. It was as if Amado Carrillo Fuentes had never truly existed. Only the empire he left behind, and the fear he etched into the sky. Even his closest allies said nothing. Some vanished altogether. Others retreated into exile or silence. One man, known to have flown beside him, boarded a plane to Brazil and was never seen again. Another turned up in an abandoned safe house with his tongue cut out and a Rolex still ticking on his wrist. The air changed. Literally. Airstrips that once pulsed with secret traffic went quiet. Radios that had buzzed with encrypted codes fell silent. Planes were grounded. Pilots disappeared. Like wings that had been clipped mid-flight. The network he built, part skeleton, part bloodstream, collapsed without a scream. No shrine, no statue, no final salute, just fog. Some said he retired to an island bought under someone else's name. Others said he was executed in secret, and his body was buried not in a graveyard, but beneath a runway he once used. A few believed he walked among them still. Face changed, name erased, legacy intact, and somewhere between all those stories and the lack of proof, a strange thing happened. He became more real, because that's the twisted magic of a man like Amado. The less you see of him, the more he lingers. In murals half-painted, in whispered warnings, in the tilt of a plane banking low over the border. Every shadow in the shape of a jet became a maybe. Every unclaimed fortune a fingerprint. Every silent family member a conspirator by default. Even the fog felt scripted, thick, and unnatural, as if nature itself conspired to blur the edges of the story, as if the sky was in on the secret. And so the Sky King vanished, not in a blaze, not in a trial, not even in a final photograph. He just evaporated, and what remained behind was not a man or a memory, but a question, one that still floats above runways, one that still echoes in static across old radios, one that still keeps powerful men glancing over their shoulder at the clouds. Where did he go? When a king disappears, the crown doesn't rest, it shatters. Without Amado, the Juarez cartel began to split like cracked glass under pressure. What once was a symphony of flight paths and bribes turned into something louder, something simpler, something soaked in chaos. Loyalty is a funny thing in the underworld. It moves like smoke. While Amado lived, men followed his shadow without question. He didn't need to raise his voice. The architecture of his empire, the airports, the radar screens, the quiet judges held everything in place like steel beams. But the moment the Sky King vanished, those beams began to tremble, and then they collapsed. His lieutenants started carving out their own skies. One claimed the western routes, another moved into border tunnels. Names changed, allegiances mutated. The organization that once operated like a cold, calculated airline transformed overnight into something closer to a battlefield. No one was safe. Not pilots, not accountants, not even priests who'd once prayed beside him. Everyone became a potential threat or a possible leak. The elegance of smuggling was replaced with the clumsiness of open war. Trucks exploded in city centers. Bodies were dumped on church steps. News anchors began using the word civil war again, though they never said who the citizens were. And through it all, people still whispered his name, because even in absence, Amado's ghost was louder than any gunfire. His absence wasn't silence, it was a scream with no direction. The men who tried to wear his shoes found the soles filled with holes. They didn't understand that it wasn't just about cocaine. It was about timing, about silence, about knowing which airstrip was clear and which radio frequency could buy you 5 more seconds of life. Instead, they played by new rules, louder ones, bloody ones. By the end of that year, Juarez was no longer a fortress. It was a scar. Entire neighborhoods became contested territory. Every wall was tagged with allegiance. Every streetlight flickered under the weight of threats. Where once planes came and went like ghosts, now trucks stuttered through with soldiers in the back and mothers clutching rosaries behind curtains. The air had changed, and somewhere, maybe far away, maybe in the heart of it all, maybe nowhere at all, someone watched with regret or amusement. The Sky King had flown so high, he forgot that every empire needs gravity, and without him, everything fell. Vicente Carrillo Leyva walked into a ghost. His father had built an empire made of silence and sky, but Vicente inherited only the smoke, no roots, no loyalty. Just the echoes of a vanished man whose name still made powerful people lower their voices. He tried. That much is true. Vicente put on the expensive shoes, wore the pressed suits, met the right people in the wrong rooms. But the air didn't move for him the way it did for Amado. The men around him didn't salute, they waited. For a mistake, for a reason, for proof that this was not the Sky King returned, but just a shadow trying to mimic sunlight. Vicente didn't command, he negotiated. And in a world built by fear and flight, negotiation sounds like weakness. The corridors his father had walked with quiet power now whispered behind his back. They called him the gentleman, polite, polished, predictable. 3 words that never built an empire. The roots had changed by then. So had the rules. The cocaine highway wasn't a straight shot anymore. It bent, twisted, crumbled. New names were rising from the ashes, men who never flew planes, but knew how to cut throats. Vicente wasn't made for that. He was made for legacy, not war. And that was the problem. He tried to rule from memory. But memory doesn't smuggle. Memory doesn't bribe judges. Memory doesn't hold a gun to a pilot's head and ask him if the coordinates were double-checked. He tried to bring back the old codes, the quiet schedules, the unspoken rules of a vanished air kingdom. But the sky had moved on. So the gentleman disappeared, just like his father, though not with myth, not with whispers of escape. Vicente's end wasn't tragic or mysterious. It was just quiet. A name on a warrant, a man in handcuffs, a face caught by a camera his father would have avoided. He never stood a chance, because the throne he reached for wasn't there anymore. Only smoke. And when he reached into it, trying to grasp what had once ruled the skies, all he caught was the wind. Some names get forgotten on the runway. Others get painted in smoke across the sky. Amado Carrillo Fuentes belonged to the latter. Pilots didn't just remember him, they invoked him. On sleepless nights over desert heat, when the engines began to stutter and the cargo shifted too loud in the hold, they'd whisper his name. Not for comfort, not for fear, for both. He was the one who made the sky sacred, who turned radar signatures into ghost trails and desert runways into holy ground. Before him, flight was just transportation. After him, it was religion. Pilots didn't fly, they served. And every airstrip he used felt touched by something more than business. The gravel seemed smoother. The lights blinked in perfect rhythm. The wind waited for clearance. Even in places long abandoned, the old crewmen say you can still hear faint echoes, not of jet engines, but of silence. A silence too clean, too deliberate, like a moment of held breath before the devil lands. To this day, old smugglers don't say his name unless the sky is clear. They won't take off with storm clouds above. Some carry charms blessed under hangars he once used. Others swear by rituals before takeoff, touching the fuselage 3 times, muttering a phrase in Spanish too soft to catch. Amado is part myth, part superstition, all shadow. No photo on a wall, no statue, just stories and fear. The younger pilots, the ones raised on newer wars and noisier cartels, laugh at it sometimes, until the radios go silent, until a signal gets scrambled over Chihuahua. Then they remember. The Sky King never needed satellites. His flights never glitched. His men never missed a mark. And in those quiet hours, somewhere between takeoff and regret, they understand the reverence. He wasn't worshipped because he flew. He was worshipped because he never fell. At least, not the way men are supposed to. His descent wasn't a crash, it was vapor. No wreckage, no black box. Just one last takeoff that never came back. So pilots still say it. In hangars, in bars, in cockpits slick with sweat. The name hangs there, heavier than fuel. Amado, not a man, not anymore. Just a pressure in the wind. They say he was seen in Havana, stepping out of a black car with windows too dark to reflect the Sunday. A man in a white linen suit, shoes that never touched dust. No security, just presence. The kind of presence that makes locals stop mid-sentence and nod without knowing why. Some claim they heard his voice ordering cafe. Others say he vanished before the steam even rose from the cup. A week later, he was spotted in Santiago, Chile, a private clinic. No name on the registry, but the guards outside had faces that didn't blink. A doctor's wife whispered that the man inside had eyes like old secrets. She hasn't spoken since. Then there was Dubai, a penthouse no one rents but is always lit. A man seen watching the planes land at dawn, drink in hand, never touching his lips. Hotel staff called him Señor Cielo, the Sky Mister, a name no one taught them. Every sighting ends the same. A blurred security tape. A witness who forgets half the details. A bodyguard who won't speak again. Authorities shrug, but in back rooms and cartel whispers, the question floats like smoke. What if he didn't die? What if the body on the table was never his? Some think the surgery worked too well. That the man who walked out of that operating room was not the same one who entered, but still him somehow. Changed, rewired, reborn. Others believe it was a switch. A decoy, that Amado paid for more than a new face he bought vanishment. Stories stack like flight plans. A passport found in Morocco, a voice print match in Madrid, a silent investor in a South African airline with roots that don't make sense. The name Carrillo shows up like a ghost, never quite enough to confirm, never quite quiet enough to ignore. And still, no photo, no interview. Just the wind moving strangely in the corridors of places he once touched. He's become the drug world's phantom. Saints have relics. Amado has rumors. In Juarez, men pour drinks for him on feast days. In Colombia, mothers still warn their sons not to fly too close to the clouds. In Mexico City, an old priest once claimed a tall man in sunglasses left a donation so large they had to build a second vault. The dead are easy to bury. But a man like Amado, he chose something else. A myth with a passport. A memory with jet fuel in its blood. A ghost in silk. And so the stories grow, like contrails vanishing into sky. High above the desert, somewhere between memory and myth, there's a statue that doesn't cast a shadow. No one can agree where it stands. Some say near the old airstrip outside Juarez. Others swear it was built deep in the Sonoran hills, where no map dares point. It's not made of bronze or marble. It's made of story, of jet fuel and reverence, of every whispered name spoken before takeoff. Pilots kneel before it without kneeling. They nod at empty clouds. They wear sky blue ribbons in their pockets and call it protection. Some carve wings into their rifles. Others trace invisible flight paths across their chests like crosses. Before each flight, there's a silence not for fear, but respect. Because somewhere up there, They believe he's watching. They call him the Sky King still. But now, he's something more. Not just a man who moved cocaine through the clouds. A figure, a phantom, a myth with wings. No tombstone, no obituary. Just turbulence that never passes. There are murals in towns that never show his face. Just planes, just silhouettes. A hand holding a radio, a horizon with no end. And every mural has the same words in paint that flakes like ashes. He flew so others could vanish. In narco ballads, they sing about the saint of escape, the angel who never landed. His verses come after midnight, the part of the song when the accordion slows and the candles flicker. They don't cheer. They close their eyes. They remember the silence between engines. Older smugglers tell younger ones, fly smart, fly fast, fly like Amado, and if your wings catch fire, don't scream, just vanish. The statue, if it exists, was not built for him. It was built by him, not with bricks, but with ghosts. The thousands of airstrips he mapped in his mind, the silence he wore like armor, the myth he became, the moment his pulse vanished beneath an operating light. Now, every gust of wind above the Sierra carries his name. Every cartel plane that lifts off under a full moon does so with a prayer stitched into its flight code. Not a prayer for safety, a prayer for silence, for shadow, for the kind of invisibility that cannot be shot down. Because Amado Carrillo Fuentes is no longer just a man. He is the contrail that never fades, the engine hum that never ends, the statue built out of clouds, forever flying, forever gone. In the middle of a routine sweep over the Gulf, a bored technician at a coastal monitoring station pauses. It's late. The air's humid. The machines hum without meaning. Then something cuts through the static, sharp, strange, brief. A ghost in the wires. The transmission's so faint it nearly goes unnoticed. Almost dismissed as junk noise, the kind old radios cough up after storms. But this one carries rhythm. Cadence, a pattern that doesn't belong to any commercial frequency. Someone somewhere is saying something. They clean the tape, rewind it, slow it down, over and over, until the voice emerges like a foghorn from beneath the waterline. Gravel-throated, deliberate, low. The sentence is short. Only 3 words, but enough to turn the room cold. It's still flying, that's all. No name. No location, no confirmation. Just that strange sentence sent from somewhere above the clouds or beneath the floor of the sea. But the voice, it sounds familiar to some. Not the kind of familiarity you recognize with your ears. The kind that punches you in the stomach before your brain catches up. They compare it to old recordings, phone calls, wiretaps, courtroom tapes leaked after the fact. And the match is close. Not identical, but enough to stir old stories back into motion. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, thought to be dead since 1997, vanished on an operating table, or faked it, or never touched that table at all. Depends who you ask. But now, years later, this voice speaks from the edge of the known world, and suddenly the past feels like it's breathing again. Some agents dismiss it. Hoax, fabrication, someone playing games with the myth. But others aren't so sure. The Juarez whispers spike again. Pilots check their mirrors twice. Sinaloa boys paint wings on their engines. No one claims to believe it out loud. But they fly lower, land quicker, and keep one eye on the sky. And that sentence, those 3 little words, become part of something bigger. A folk tale, a code, a warning. It's printed on keychains, muttered before takeoff, tattooed behind the ears of those who know. Some say it's nothing, others say it's everything. Because if that voice truly belonged to the Sky King, then he was never caught, never buried, never ended. Just disappeared into the clouds, wrapped in tailwind and silence. And maybe he's still island somewhere above us, charting new routes, changing faces, outflying the end. It's still flying. The engines are silent now. No more thunder overhead. No more whispers carried on the wind. The runways are still. lined with dust and memory. The sky, once torn open by wings that never waited for permission, is finally calm. No circling jets, no coded transmissions, no cargo wrapped in silence, just clouds, drifting like slow thoughts. They say he's dead, or they say he's not. Doesn't matter, not really. Whether he vanished beneath a surgeon's blade or disappeared behind a different passport, the story has landed. The pages are closing. The Sky King, who once ruled altitudes like kingdoms, is no longer at the helm. Maybe he's watching from somewhere, older now, face remade, name discarded like a jacket too warm for the new season. Or maybe there's nothing left but a ghost made of air roots and ambition. But tonight, none of that matters. The air is clean, the radar is empty, and your heart can slow. You're safe. The warplanes of commerce have faded. The empire built on lift and logistics has exhaled its last breath. You're not being watched through satellite eyes anymore. The maps have gone blank again. Borders aren't trembling under the weight of shadow cargo. For once, you can trust the silence. No more double lives. No more jet black suits without names. No more questions about whose hand was on the yoke. He's gone. Or hiding in plain sight. Either way, it's over for now. So, close your eyes. Let your thoughts settle like fog on an empty tarmac. Let the stillness wrap around you like a seatbelt before takeoff. The man who once carved the heavens into highways has touched ground, and the sky is quiet. Sleep.